Welcome to this lesson from Q-Log Lernmedien. I'm Julianne and I'll help you understand one of the most important topics in international trade. Today's topic, Incoterms 2020. These are the 11 international trade terms that play a central role in global trade. We'll answer the three most important questions. Who pays the costs? Who bears the risk? At what point does risk transfer? So this doesn't stay abstract. A concrete, real-world example will accompany us through every term. Incoterms stands for International Commercial Terms. These are standardized trade terms. They're published by the International Chamber of Commerce, or ICC for short. The current edition dates from 2020. What do these terms cover? They define where and when the goods are handed over, at what point transport risk passes to the buyer, who bears which transport costs, who is responsible for export and import clearance, and who bears the related costs, and, for certain terms, who must insure the goods. Just as important is what Incoterms do not cover. They say nothing about the transfer of ownership, nothing about the purchase price, nothing about payment terms, nothing about warranty or product liability, nothing about the governing law or jurisdiction, and nothing about the consequences of a breach of contract. All of that belongs in the sales contract. Incoterms are a supplement to the sales contract, not a replacement. The 11 terms fall into two groups. The first group applies to any mode of transport, so truck, rail, air, sea, or a combination of these. That's 7 terms. First, we have EXW and FCA. Then CPT and CIP. And finally, DAP, DPU, and DDP. The second group applies only to sea and inland waterway transport. That's 4 terms. FAS and FOB. Then CFR and CIF. An important rule of thumb up front. Container cargo almost always belongs in the first group. That's true even when the container ends up traveling by ship. To bring some order to the 11 terms, a simple grouping by first letter helps. E, F, C, and D. The E group, that's EXW, is the collection term. Here the seller bears the absolute minimum. The buyer essentially picks up the goods from the seller. In the F group, that's FCA, FAS, and FOB, the seller hands the goods over to the carrier or makes them available for shipping, but the buyer pays for the main carriage. In the C group, that's CPT, CIP, CFR, and CIF. The seller pays for the main carriage. Now pay close attention. Risk still passes to the buyer earlier than that. This separation of cost and risk is the classic trap. The D group, that's DAP, DPU, and DDP, covers the arrival terms. Here, the seller bears cost and risk all the way to the destination country. In short, the further we move from E to D, the more obligations the seller takes on. EXWX works is the term with the fewest obligations for the seller. Risk passes as soon as the goods are made available at the seller's works or warehouse, so even before loading. The buyer bears almost everything: loading, transport, export, and import. An example. A machinery manufacturer sells a production line EXW Stuttgart to a customer in Brazil. The seller only makes the equipment available, packaged, at its own works. The Brazilian buyer arranges and pays for everything else. That means the truck to the port, export clearance, sea freight, and import into Brazil. If the equipment is already damaged while being loaded onto the truck, that's the buyer's risk. That applies at least as long as the seller hasn't explicitly taken on the loading itself. A tip from practice. EXW is often impractical for exports. A foreign buyer can often not handle the export declaration in the European Union themselves. That's why the next term is frequently the better choice. FCA, free carrier, is considered the recommended alternative to EXW. Risk passes as soon as the seller hands the goods over to the carrier nominated by the buyer. The seller handles export clearance and transport up to the agreed handover point. The buyer pays for the main carriage and handles the import. An example. A supplier in Hamburg sells spare parts FCA Frankfurt Airport to a customer in the United States. The seller handles the export declaration and delivers the goods to the air freight terminal in Frankfurt. Once the goods are handed over to the airline which the buyer has booked, risk passes to the buyer. The buyer pays the air freight and the import into the United States. FCA is the most flexible term in the F group, and today a very important term for container and air freight. CPT, carriage paid to, is our first C term. With this one, we enter the territory of the well-known trap. The seller pays for transport to the named destination and handles export clearance, but risk passes much earlier, namely at handover to the first carrier, not only on arrival. An example. A manufacturer in Munich sells control units CPT Warsaw. The seller pays the full freight to Warsaw. But if the goods are damaged in an accident in the Czech Republic on the way, the buyer bears the loss, because risk already transferred in Munich at handover to the forwarder. The buyer should therefore check whether they need their own transport insurance. Remember this. Under the C terms, the seller pays for transport, but risk travels with the buyer from the handover point onward. CIP, carriage and insurance paid to, works exactly like CPT when it comes to risk. Risk passes to the buyer at handover to the first carrier. The big difference, the seller must also take out transport insurance in the buyer's favor. There's an important rule in the 2020 edition here. Under CIP, a high level of insurance cover is mandatory. This usually means cover under the Institute Cargo Clauses A or a comparable level of cover. Insurance is typically arranged for 110% of the goods value. An example. A pharmaceutical company ships temperature-sensitive active ingredients CIP Tokyo. The seller pays the freight to Tokyo and arranges high-level transport insurance under Institute Cargo Clauses A for 110% of the goods value in the buyer's favor. If the cargo is damaged in flight, the buyer bears the risk, but they're covered by the insurance policy the seller arranged. DAP, delivered at place, is the first of our arrival terms. It's very popular in business-to-business trade because it's clear and easy to apply. Risk passes only once the ready-to-unload vehicle has arrived at the named destination, and that's before unloading. The seller bears transport and risk all the way to the destination. The buyer handles unloading and import. An example. A furniture manufacturer in Bavaria delivers office furniture DAP warehouse Musterstraße, Vienna. The seller arranges and pays for the entire transport right up to the ramp of the warehouse in Vienna, bearing the risk until then. The buyer has to unload the truck and, if any duties apply, handle the import. DPU, delivered at place unloaded, is a special case. It's the only Incoterms term under which the seller must also unload the goods at the destination. It was renamed in the 2020 edition. It replaces the earlier term DAT. Risk passes only after the goods have been unloaded at the named destination. An example. An exhibition builder delivers a complete trade show stand DPU Milan Exhibition Center, Hall 3. The seller transports the stand to Milan and has it lifted off the truck there by crane. If a crate tips over during unloading, that's still the seller's risk. Only once everything is unloaded and in place does risk pass to the buyer. A tip from practice: only agree to DPU if the seller can genuinely organize and control the unloading at the destination. Otherwise, DAP is often the better choice. DP, delivered, duty paid, is the mirror image of EXW. Here the seller bears the maximum level of obligation. They pay for transport, handle export, handle import clearance, and bear all duties arising on import unless otherwise agreed. Risk passes only on arrival at the named destination, ready for unloading, similar to DAP. An example: a German online retailer delivers devices DDP Zurich to a Swiss company. The seller pays for transport, handles the Swiss import, and covers duty as well as import tax. The buyer receives the goods almost like a domestic delivery. A word of caution on the paperwork. For DDP, the seller may need a tax registration or a representative in the destination country. This effort is frequently underestimated in practice. Now for the group of pure sea freight terms. FAS, free alongside ship, is a niche term. It's best suited to bulk cargo, heavy cargo, or project cargo. For example, timber, steel, or large machine parts. It's not intended for container cargo. Risk passes as soon as the goods are placed alongside the vessel at the port of shipment. So on the quay or on a barge. The seller bears transport to the port and export clearance. The buyer handles loading, sea freight, and import. An example: a timber exporter sells sawn timber FAS port of Bremen to a buyer in Morocco. The seller brings the timber packages to the agreed quay in Bremen and places them alongside the ship. Export clearance has already been completed. From that moment, the buyer bears the risk. They arrange the crane, the loading on board, and the sea freight to Casablanca. FOB, free on board, is the classic term in sea trade. Risk passes as soon as the goods are placed on board the vessel at the port of shipment. The seller bears transport to the port, export clearance, and loading on board. The buyer pays the sea freight and handles the import. An example: a German textile trader buys goods FOB Shanghai from a Chinese manufacturer. The manufacturer brings the goods to the port, handles Chinese export clearance, and has them loaded on board. As soon as the goods are on board the vessel, the German buyer bears the risk. They've booked the sea freight to Hamburg and handle the import into the European Union. An important note: strictly speaking, FOB only fits conventional loading. Containers are usually handed over at the terminal, not on board. FCA is the cleaner solution there. CFR, cost and freight, applies the C term logic to sea freight. Risk passes just as under FOB, that means on placing the goods on board at the port of shipment, but the seller additionally pays the sea freight to the named port of destination. An example: a Turkish steel producer sells coils CFR Rotterdam to a German trader. The seller books and pays for the sea freight from Izmir to Rotterdam. If the vessel runs into a storm on the way and the cargo is damaged, it's still the buyer's problem, because risk already passed on loading in Izmir. Without their own insurance, the buyer is left with the loss. The same rule applies here. Paid freight doesn't mean covered risk. CIF, cost, insurance, and freight, is widely used in commodity trading. When it comes to risk, it behaves just like FOB and CFR. Risk passes on placing the goods on board at the port of shipment. The seller additionally takes out marine insurance in the buyer's favor. Important, and unlike CIP, under CIF, only minimum cover is mandatory. This usually means cover under the Institute Cargo Clauses C. An example: An importer buys raw coffee, CIF Hamburg, from an exporter in Santos, Brazil. The exporter pays the sea freight to Hamburg and insures the cargo under the minimum cover. That only protects against certain named perils such as stranding or fire. If the coffee is damaged by seawater, for example, and that damage isn't covered by the minimum cover, the buyer bears the loss. For high-value goods, it's therefore worth agreeing on higher cover contractually, for example, under the clauses A. To close, the 4 most important takeaways for your practice. First, always agree precisely. State the term, the exact place, and the addition. For example, FCA, Frankfurt Airport, Terminal 2, Incoterms 2020. Second, for containers, FCA usually belongs in the contract, not FOB. Containers are handed over at the terminal, not on board. The classic sea freight terms mainly fit conventional loading. Third, under the C terms, cost and risk are not the same thing. Under CPT, CIP, CFR, and CIF, the seller pays for transport, but the buyer carries the risk en route. Fourth, check the insurance. CIP requires high-level cover. CIF requires only minimum cover. You should deliberately check and close that gap contractually if the goods are valuable or sensitive. That brings us to the end of this lesson. Thank you for your attention and good luck applying the Incoterms. A lesson from Q-Log Lernmedien.